May 1945 across Britain, sprawling vehicle parks stretch for miles in the countryside near Southampton, Liverpool, and dozens of other ports. Row upon row of American lorries sit in precisely organized formations, their olive-drab paint already showing signs of wear from years of hard service. These are not British vehicles. They bear the distinctive angular styling of Detroit manufacturers, the rounded bonnets of Chevrolet, the flat grilles of Ford, the sturdy frames of GMC and Studebaker. More than 480,000 American trucks and LRIs had crossed the Atlantic under the Lend-Lease program, the vast majority destined for British forces. Now, with victory in Europe secured and Japan's surrender merely weeks away, these vehicles present an extraordinary logistical and political challenge. They belong to the United States government. Britain has used them, maintained them, and worn them out in service from North Africa to Northwest Europe. But ownership was never transferred. As peace arrives, difficult questions emerge. What happens to nearly 500,000 foreign-owned vehicles scattered across Britain and continental Europe? Can they be purchased? Must they be returned? Should they be destroyed? The answers would reveal the harsh financial realities facing post-war Britain and determine the fate of the largest single vehicle fleet ever assembled under one program. The scale of Britain's dependence on American vehicles becomes starkly apparent in the immediate aftermath of victory. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States had shipped 427,284 trucks and lorries to Britain alone, with another 52,000 sent to British Empire forces. These figures dwarf Britain's own production. The vehicles represented every category: 1.5-ton Dodge weapons carriers, 2.5-ton GMC cargo lorries, 4-tonne diamond tank transporters, massive 6-tonne white heavy haulage trucks, Chevrolet 1500 weight utility vehicles, and thousands of specialized variants, including ambulances, mobile, workshops, and radio vans. They had formed the backbone of British logistics throughout the war. By May 1945, these American vehicles constituted approximately 60% of Britain's total military lorry fleet. The 8th Army in Italy relied on them almost entirely. The British 2nd Army in Germany possessed American vehicles at a ratio of 3.1 over British models. Vehicle parks in Britain itself held approximately 180,000 American lorries, whilst another 120,000 sat in depots across France, Belgium, and Germany. Some 85,000 remained in the Mediterranean theatre. The remainder were scattered from India to Burma, from Egypt to Palestine. The vehicles varied tremendously in condition. Some had covered less than 5,000 tons. Others, particularly those that had served since North Africa in 1942, showed 80,000 tons on their clocks and extensive mechanical wear. The immediate challenge was both political and financial. The Lend-Lease Act had always been clear. Equipment was loaned, not given. As the war ends, the United States government expects either the return of serviceable equipment or payment for items Britain wishes to retain. American officials arrive in Britain within weeks of V-Day to conduct assessments. The Foreign Liquidation Commission, established specifically to handle overseas Lend-Lease disposal, sends teams to survey vehicle parks and determine values. Their initial position alarms British officials. The United States wants either the vehicles back or payment at depreciated but still substantial rates. The Americans propose that vehicles in good condition might cost Britain $400 each, those in fair condition $250, and even worn-out lorries $100. With nearly 500,000 vehicles in British possession, the sums prove astronomical. Britain, essentially bankrupt from 6 years of war, cannot afford to purchase what it had come to depend upon. The Foreign Office and Treasury officials scramble to negotiate more favourable terms. American negotiators, led by representatives from the State Department and War Department, initially show little flexibility. They point out that many vehicles, particularly those stationed in Britain itself, remain in good condition and possess clear commercial value. The American automobile industry wants these vehicles returned or destroyed to prevent competition with post-war production. Surplus American military trucks flooding European markets might undercut new vehicle sales. Through summer 1945, negotiations continue whilst the vehicles sit in their parks, consuming guard labour and deteriorating in the weather. The British position grows desperate. Foreign currency reserves have reached critically low levels. The country needs every dollar for essential food imports and raw materials. Spending hundreds of millions on trucks seems impossible. Yet Britain's economy requires transport capacity for reconstruction. American officials recognise Britain's predicament, but face congressional pressure to recoup Lend-Lease costs and protect domestic manufacturers. September 1945 brings Truman's abrupt termination of the Lend-Lease program. The decision announced on 21st August shocks British officials. Within days, all Lend-Lease shipments cease. Items already afloat continue to British ports, but the pipeline empties. This sudden termination increases pressure for a settlement on existing equipment. British negotiators, led by representatives from the Ministry of Supply and the War Office, intensified discussions with the Foreign Liquidation Commission. The breakthrough comes through a creative accounting approach. Rather than purchasing vehicles outright, Britain negotiates a comprehensive settlement covering all Lend-Lease materials retained. The Anglo-American Financial Agreement signed in December 1945 establishes that Britain will pay $650 million for all Lend-Lease equipment it wishes to retain, including the trucks. This represents roughly 10% of the equipment's original value. The settlement permits Britain to keep vehicles deemed essential whilst requiring disposal of surplus equipment. The agreement specifies that vehicles kept for military use need not be paid for immediately, but fall under the general loan terms. Those transferred to civilian use must be paid for within the settlement framework. By early 1946, British authorities begin the massive task of sorting nearly 500,000 vehicles into categories: retention for military service, transfer to civilian ministries, sale to Commonwealth nations, scrapping or abandonment overseas. The Ministry of Supply establishes regional depots at Chilwell, Donington, Bicester and elsewhere to process the enormous fleet. Teams of mechanics and administrators worked through the winter of 1945 to 46, inspecting, categorizing, and documenting each vehicle. Those deemed essential for continued military service number approximately 125,000. These include newer models with low mileage, specialized variants difficult to replace, and vehicles needed for the occupation forces in Germany. Another 95,000 vehicles receive approval for transfer to civilian government use. The Ministry of Transport takes thousands for road maintenance work. The Ministry of Agriculture receives lorries for forestry operations. Local authorities across Britain acquire American trucks for refuge collection, fire services, and general municipal work. British military authorities face particular challenges in Germany, where approximately 78,000 American vehicles serve with the British Army of the Rhine. The occupation requires substantial transport capacity, yet maintaining such a large foreign fleet proves complicated. Spare parts become increasingly difficult to obtain as American military stocks run down. The War Office decides to retain about 45,000 American lorries in Germany, primarily newer GMC and Studebaker models, whilst declaring older vehicles surplus. These surplus vehicles cannot return to Britain economically. Shipping costs would exceed their value. Instead, British authorities begin selling them locally. The Control Commission for Germany establishes vehicle disposal centres in Hamburg, Hanover, and the Ruhr. German transport companies, desperate for vehicles to rebuild their shattered economy, purchase thousands of worn Chevrolets, Dodges, and Fords. Prices remain low, typically $50 to $150 per vehicle, depending on condition. By late 1946, some 22,000 American trucks originally supplied to Britain under Lend-Lease have entered German civilian service. They become a common sight on German roads, often repainted and bearing German registration plates, quietly assisting reconstruction. Meanwhile, Commonwealth negotiations proceed through 1946. Canada, which had received 237,000 American vehicles under its own Lend-Lease allocation, faced similar challenges. Australia had received 44,000. Both dominions negotiate similar Settlements with the United States, paying reduced rates for retained vehicles. Britain offers to sell some of its allocation to Commonwealth partners who need additional transport capacity. New Zealand purchases 3,400 American lorries from British stocks. South Africa takes 2,100. India, facing its own transport shortage, receives 8,500 vehicles transferred from British military stocks in the Middle East. The Soviet approach to Lend-Lease vehicles, though not directly comparable, provides interesting contrast. The Soviets had received approximately 427,000 American trucks under Lend-Lease, nearly identical to Britain's allocation. Unlike Britain, the Soviet Union simply kept everything. When American officials requested accounting and return of surplus equipment, Soviet authorities provided minimal cooperation. Most American vehicles that had survived Soviet service remained in Soviet hands, many serving well into the 1950s. Some Studebaker US-6 trucks, particularly popular with Soviet forces, continued in military service until the 1960s. The Soviet refusal to engage seriously with Lend-Lease accounting became one of many early Cold War tensions. Britain, despite financial desperation, honored the negotiated settlement terms. This contrast in approaches reflected differing relationships with the United States as the wartime alliance fragmented. If you're finding this deep dive into post-war vehicle disposal interesting, consider subscribing for more stories about the logistical aftermath of World War II. Back in Britain, systematic disposal of surplus American vehicles accelerates through 1946 and 1947. The vehicles deemed uneconomical to retain number approximately 185,000. These vehicles face various fates depending on condition and location. Those in reasonable mechanical order but surplus to requirements go to auction. The Ministry of Supply organises sales at depots throughout Britain. Private haulage firms, still recovering from wartime restrictions, purchase thousands of Chevrolet and Ford lorries. Agricultural contractors buy four-wheel drive Dodgers for farm work. Construction companies acquire Diamond T and white heavy lorries for building projects. Prices vary from $180 for good condition 2.5-ton GMCs, TU8 for worn Chevrolet utilities. These sales generate approximately $18 million for the Treasury, a modest sum but welcome given Britain's financial straits. Vehicles in poor condition face scrapping. The steel shortage facing British industry in 1946 makes scrap metal valuable. Dealers purchase worn-out American trucks for $15 to $30 each, then cut them apart at scrapyards in Birmingham, Sheffield and South Wales. By 1948, approximately 67,000 former Lend-Lease vehicles have been reduced to scrap metal, their steel feeding Britain's reconstruction. Some vehicles simply prove uneconomical to move or process. In remote storage areas, particularly in Scotland and Northern Ireland, clusters of damaged or cannibalized American lorries sit abandoned. The Ministry of Supply lacks resources to transport them to scrapyards. These vehicles gradually deteriorate through the late 1940s, eventually becoming derelict hulks buried by vegetation. Small numbers survive into the 1950s before finally being cleared. The Mediterranean theatre presents particular disposal challenges. Approximately 62,000 American vehicles in British service remain in Egypt, Palestine, Libya, and Italy in mid-1945. As British forces draw down, these vehicles become surplus. The Middle East Command establishes disposal centres in Cairo and Alexandria. Thousands of warners go to Egyptian contractors and transport operators. When British forces withdraw from Palestine in 1948, they leave behind approximately 8,000 American vehicles, some falling into Israeli hands, others to Arab forces. In Libya, the remnants of the desert campaigns litter remote areas. Hundreds of abandoned American trucks, too damaged or remote for recovery, gradually disappear beneath sand. Civilian integration of retained American vehicles transforms British roads through the late 1940s. Distinctive squared-off profiles of Chevrolet and GMC lorries become common sights. Rural fire brigades operate converted Dodge ambulances. Forestry operations rely on four-wheel drive power wagons. Small haulage firms build businesses around cheap surplus American trucks. These vehicles possess advantages over British lorries of the era. Their simple, robust engineering proves easy to maintain. Parts, whilst not abundant, remain available through specialist dealers who stockpile components from scrapped vehicles. The powerful engines designed for American conditions cope well with overloading common in post-war Britain. However, fuel consumption proves problematic. American engines designed when petrol was cheap and abundant consume significantly more fuel than British equivalents. As petrol rationing continues through the late 1940s, this becomes a serious drawback. Operating costs force many civilian users to replace their American vehicles with more economical British models by 1950. The military retention fleet faces different challenges. Through 1946 and 1947, the War Office maintains approximately 125,000 American vehicles in military service. Spare parts increasingly constrain operations. The Americans, having disposed of their own surplus stocks by 1948, no longer produced parts for wartime models. British military workshops begin cannibalizing damaged vehicles to keep others running. Engineering units manufacture improvised replacement parts. By 1949, the remaining American fleet in British service has declined to 73,000 vehicles. A further colour occurs in 1950 to 51 as the Ministry of Supply pushes for standardisation on British models. The Korean War temporarily extends the service life of some vehicles, particularly heavy lorries in short supply, but by 1953 the British military has reduced American vehicle holdings to approximately 28,000 units, mostly specialised types, or vehicles serving in overseas garrisons where parts remain available. Several thousand American vehicles find their way into preservation, though rarely through intentional efforts. Museums show little interest in common military lorries during the 1940s and 1950s. However, vehicles passing into civilian service sometimes survive through continued use. Small Hague firms, municipal services, and agricultural operations occasionally retain American trucks well beyond their economic life, particularly if they've developed maintenance expertise. A few examples enter museum collections by the 1960s. The Imperial War Museum acquires a GMC CCKW 2.5-ton lorry in 1967, one that had served throughout Northwest Europe. The National Motor Museum at Beaulieu later obtains a Dodge WC series weapons carrier. The Tank Museum at Boynton preserves a Diamond tank transporter, one of the massive vehicles that had moved British armour from Normandy to the Rhine. Private collectors begin seeking American military vehicles from the 1970s onwards. As military vehicle preservation becomes an established hobby, enthusiasts discover surviving examples in farm sheds, scrapyards, and municipal depots. A Studebaker US-6 emerges from a Scottish forestry depot in 1982, still in running condition after decades of timber hauling. Recovery efforts in remote areas occasionally yield discoveries. Several American vehicles abandoned in the Scottish Highlands during post-war training exercises have been recovered and restored. Today, British military vehicle collections hold approximately 85 examples of American Lend-Lorries in various conditions. These represent perhaps 0.02% of the original fleet. The Wiltshire-based Military Vehicle Trust operates several restored GMCs and Dodges at shows and events. Private collectors own perhaps 200 additional examples, mostly Dodge weapons carriers and Jeeps, though Jeeps formed a separate program from the truck allocation. Continental Europe holds additional survivors. German museums preserve several American trucks that entered civilian service after 1945. The Overoon War Museum in the Netherlands displays a GMC recovered from a local haulage firm. The Auto and Technik Museum in Sins, Germany, exhibits an intact Ford G8T that served in British military service before German civilian use. The legacy of Britain's Lend-Lease trucks extends beyond the physical vehicles. The experience fundamentally shaped post-war British military vehicle development. British manufacturers studied American design approaches intensively. The simplicity and standardization of American vehicles impressed British engineers who had dealt with numerous incompatible British models during the war. When Britain developed its next generation of Military lorries in the 1950s, including the Bedford RL series, American influence showed clearly in simplified maintenance features and standardized components. The financial settlement of Lend-Lease vehicles also created lasting policy impacts. The experience taught British officials harsh lessons about dependency on foreign equipment. The requirement to negotiate retention terms whilst effectively bankrupt influenced British defence policy for decades. Subsequent governments prioritized maintaining domestic production capacity for essential military equipment even at higher costs to avoid similar vulnerability. The rapid disposal and disappearance of nearly 500,000 vehicles also demonstrates how quickly even massive programs can vanish from the landscape. Within 5 years of war's end, the vast majority had been scrapped, sold, or abandoned. Within 10 years, remaining examples had become unusual sights. Within 20 years, they had become rare. This pattern would repeat with much Cold War military equipment, enormous investments that disappeared within decades of obsolescence. The story of Britain's Lend-Lease trucks reveals the unglamorous but essential logistics of war's aftermath. The dramatic moment of victory in May 1945 gave way to years of administrative processing, financial negotiation, and systematic disposal. The race to secure German technology might capture more attention, but the fate of 500,000 ordinary lorries tells a more fundamental story about post-war Britain. The country emerged victorious but financially exhausted, unable even to purchase the vehicles it had worn out in service. The Americans, whilst ultimately generous in settlement terms, still insisted on payment or return. The solution involved creative accounting, mass disposal, and acceptance that the enormous vehicle fleet would largely disappear. Today, the few surviving examples serve as tangible reminders of the scale of Allied cooperation and the logistical foundations that underpinned victory. The GMC and Studebaker lorries displayed in British museums represent not just vehicles, but the industrial might that sustained armies across continents. They also remind us how thoroughly the material evidence of even recent history can vanish when economic and practical considerations drive disposal. If you found this video insightful, watch what happened to Germany's V-2 rockets after World War II next. It explores how the captured missiles sparked the space race and became the foundation for Cold War ballistic missile programs. Like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell for more. Thanks for watching.